Welcome to Quilting's first reality show. Yes. Unscripted and live with Susan Smith. Yes.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Susan Smith, and you are in my studio, Stitched by Susan. I'm coffee in hand, as I so often am, standing well back from the quilt. Today's live and unscripted episode will be the finishing up, hopefully, of quilting a project that I started in an earlier episode. You can look for the Friendship Quilt if you want to see the beginning. This is a very special quilt to me. It was made by students and friends, and one of my students, who is a friend, but I've never actually met her in real life, Joan, was the person who brainstormed it and coordinated putting it all together. So there's a lot of signature blocks in it. It's scrappy. It has a lot of different fabrics in it. In the earlier episode, I talked much more about the loading process because the backing is pieced as well and it's not symmetrical. So how I kind of thought that through and loaded it and all those things. But today, hopefully, we're going to finish up quilting it. So there's an edge-to-edge design in the middle, and then there's piano key parallel lines on the border kind of framing it all in. So we'll be doing a bit of ruler work today, be advancing the quilt today. You'll get to see some of the signatures today. And of course, my freehand plume design, which I'll be quilting all over it. If you are new here, please know this is not really a class. This is just me quilting in my studio, and you get an opportunity to join me and see what I'm doing. And because I'm a talker and explainer, I talk about the things while I'm doing them and what my reasons are and what my decisions and choices are. So whatever you can glean from that, great. I know that as long armors, it's not easy to visit each other and, quilt alongside your best buddy because you can't take your long arm to each other's house. So this is, kind of your stand-in for that. So welcome into my studio as I quilt. Okay, a few places. Catherine, will you be showing how to reload the quilt? Any tips? That's a really good question, Catherine. I will talk about that a little bit, and please remind me because I'll do it early on. So if I don't do it right away, please remind me because a couple things I want to say before I dive into the quilting. A few more places that you can find me. One is I have a podcast for easy listening, and it's called Measure Twice, Cut Once, and it is mostly interviews with other crafters and generally quilters, just hearing their story and what their craft has meant to them. So you can find all the episodes that I've released so far at podcast.stitchedbysusan.com. Also, I'm in the process of re-releasing all those episodes onto YouTube. So if you're watching on YouTube now, there's actually a playlist for the podcast. And so that now it's easy listening as well, but you get to see quilting pictures while it's running, and it is closed captioned. So if you like reading while you listen, that is there too. So that's two options for that. Secondly, and this is kind of important, next week, Saturday, I have a workshop coming up, a free workshop. So this is being aired in mid-October. So 21st of October will be this workshop, and you'll be receiving an email later today or tomorrow with many more details about it and the link for signing up for it. But this workshop has to do with, it's called Freehand Quilting Demystified, 5 myths that tie freehand quilters in knots and how to break free of them. I hear the same objections, if you will, reasons/excuses Okay, have we got sound now? I know it'll take you a few minutes to respond again. Sorry about that. We did put fresh recharged batteries in, but something went amiss there, so thanks for letting us know. And yeah, these are live and unscripted, by the way, and this is what happens in real-time streaming of quilting. And so you'll get that throughout today and throughout all these episodes. Whatever happens, happens, and you get to see us dealing with it on the spot. So part of the process, right? Okay, so where was I? I was talking about the workshop coming up, and the fact that it's 5 myths that tie freehand quilters in knots and how to break free of them. So this whole workshop is packed with my photos and stories and experiences, and now students as well, because I've been teaching for a while, of how to break through those myths, to find a way past them, to solve them, a fresh way to look at things, with a ton of examples and ideas for you. So no excuses anymore. And by the end of that workshop, I hope that you come away feeling encouraged and empowered and like you can do it. If you want to free motion quilt, I believe you absolutely can do it. It is a learned skill, and it's a step-by-step process. So that workshop is open to everyone, whether you've been before or not, doesn't matter. It is delivered live, so every time is a little bit different. Everyone's welcome to come and glean what you can from it. There's a little workbook that comes with it, etc. So be watching your emails today and tomorrow for a little more information on that, and also social media posts over the next week, which will have links to the registration for it. Mr. Producer's looking at me with a question. Okay. So that's the workshop coming up. What else is coming up? Well, we'll talk more as we get quilting. How about that? But one thing I do want to say, before we do get started quilting, I would love if you would give this episode a thumbs up. There's an opportunity to share it with a friend still. There's time for them to get on board and subscribe to the channel. I would appreciate that. YouTube, as always, is free to all the viewers. But if you do care to support my show in particular, you can do that easily by going to buymeacoffee.com/stitched by Susan. There, as little as $5, you can make a one-time contribution, or if you wish, you can sign up for a monthly one. And every dollar that comes in there, we put toward continually bettering our equipment and hopefully getting a better and better show for you. So we appreciate all those of you who support, and at the very end of this show, we'll have some rolling credits where the members' names are. So watch for your name there if you're a regular supporter. Okay, here comes a comment. Dave's looking dapper. Dapper Dave. Okay, we don't even want to go there. Joan. I think Dave just wanted us to see his hat. Very cool, by the way. You know, probably true. I'm sure he arranged for the batteries to just peter out right there, right? There's Mr. Producer. With him in the camera, let's take a moment to thank those who help make this show possible. He is first and foremost, of course, because he sits behind the scene, keeping all the cameras rolling and the microphones mostly, and the lights and the action and all that stuff. Also, our son Will does the voices that introduce the show at the beginning, his various interpretations. They're pretty fun. And then our good friend Dan, who allows us to use his lovely, relaxing guitar music for all of our episodes. So we appreciate that. All right, shall we get on to quilting? A last little bit of coffee. Let's maybe have the overhead camera for a moment, Dave, and I will show the quilt a bit. Here is the Friendship Quilt, you guys. It's so pretty. And you can see the blocks that have the various signatures in them. Like I said, a lot of students and a few of my quilting buddies as well are represented here. And in the very center of the quilt, my sister made one. I have one sister. She's a quilter also. So she made a block to put in, but she also made one representing my mom with calico cotton that was my mother's. My mom's been gone for almost 30 years. So it's a long time since we made a quilt together, but it's really fun to have my mom represented in this quilt as well, because she's a huge part of my quilting story. So scrappy, brightly colored quilt, and kudos to Joan, because I don't think these bright colors, Alison Glass is my favorite designer, and there's quite a bit of Alison Glass sprinkled throughout. I don't think these bright colors are Joan's first choice, but kudos to Joan for pulling it together and making a very beautiful quilt for me. You can see up here some of the piecing that is in the back. For the backing, I think what Joan was trying to do was those students who made squares also sent her scraps. So she used up every little teeny tiny scrap. So both in the half square triangles that are the border and then in the backing. So there's a whole strip of this that goes all the way down the quilt from top to bottom. And that's really fun. So Cindy, I think it was asking about the reloading process because I began this quilt some weeks ago and took it off of my long arm. So there's kind of two ways to do that. And I'll tell you what I did, and then I'll tell you what I maybe should have done. What I did was unloaded the whole thing entirely. Chiefly because I like to use the red snapper loading system, which you can't really see on here, but on almost all my other episodes, I load up with it. So it involves a tiny little rod that goes through a hem of the leader and then another rod that snaps over the top, and that's how I attach the quilt. Well, I only have one set of those. So if I just zipped my quilt off, which I'll describe in a minute, that would have tied up my red snappers all these weeks, right? And I knew I didn't want to do that. So I did fully unload the quilt. But more often when I'm taking a quilt down, it's just to slip in one other project for a day or something like that. And so my leaders actually have, we just cannot see it on camera, can we? How can I do this? I just don't know how to show you guys, so I'll tell you, and when we get to the bottom of the quilt, I'll try and remember to show you. But the canvas leaders that are attached to my rails actually have a zipper. So there's the portion attached to the rail and then a few inches of length, and then there's a zipper, and then the portion that has the hem. So I actually can have a quilt attached to that hemmed area, whether pinned or red snappered. And if I want to take it off my frame, I literally can just unzip it and take that one away, and then I have a new set of that end piece and zipper that I can zip back on. And so I can actually move between quilts in that way. And I've done that lots of times, and it actually works super well. But in the case of this one, I literally reloaded it, and it was a bit fiddly, but I was able to do it. This whole end toward me was unquilted. So I started there, reloaded the backing, and then just rolled the whole thing on, quilt and all, until I got to the portion that had been quilted already. So at the other end, then it was quilted, but there was still backing space, right? So I was able to load that on with my red snappers. And if I was using pins, I could load it on with the pins as well. So the only thing that I put a little extra care and attention into was the whole quilt wanted to compress a little bit when it was off the frame. And so I worked a little bit to smooth that out and make sure that on my rail, it was as wide as the unquilted part, right? To make sure that I'm getting the same squareness in my quilt going through. So that was really the only extra attention that I gave it. And so, you know, you literally can smooth this out as it's rolling up, squidge it out toward the sides. And I honestly do that sometimes when I'm quilting. If you've got some dense quilting, it will want to pull in as you're rolling up, and the back end of your quilt will be narrower than the front end of your quilt. I use that same method. Squish it out toward the sides, tug, whatever I need to do to keep that roll as wide as my quilt until it gets released. Okay, I think that's enough talking, you guys. Let's get started quilting. So we're going to be working on the center first, and I'm doing an edge-to-edge design in the whole area that's got white and scraps in it in the middle, and then doing, you can hardly see the edge, but this very side edge has a piano key type border. And I am using 2 thread colors. So I've just got an eggshell on both top and bottom for the whole central portion. And on the outer dark portion, I put a fairly dark gray on the top and a mid gray on the bobbin, because my backing is mostly white. So I didn't love the charcoal on the white. So I kind of bridged that gap with a lighter color there. So I've already basted around the perimeter of this white. And some of these steps, I know I was going to get right started quilting. Let me get on camera again for a second, if you would, Mr. Producer, sir. A few of these steps I'm doing in a bit different order for your sake than I might have if I was just quilting it, only because I wanted you today to be able to get a sampling of that edge-to-edge quilting in the middle, of the ruler work at the side, etc. If I was just doing this on my own, I would have done all these things probably in one pass. I would have basted the outside edge, stitched in the ditch along that central border, and then I would have done all the edge-to-edge work in the middle, and that would have all been done with my white thread. Then when everything was stabilized, I probably would have come back and done the whole piano key border, and then only had to change thread that one time, right? And that border wouldn't shift at all because it's, you know, it's stitched on the outer perimeter and stitched in the ditch. Does that make sense? So that it would have all been stabilized, and I could have done that border all in one fell swoop. Well, now as it happens, I wanted to be able, hopefully, to finish the quilt on camera today. And so I've done both middle stitching and borders down to where I am now. And then I'm not all that far actually from the end of the quilt, maybe 2 more feet, 3 more feet. And so I actually did go around to the bottom and baste the bottom edge and stitch in the ditch around the white portion again, so that everything is stable now and I can go back and forth a little bit. So there's my reasoning for that. Mr. Producer and I are just chatting here whether we want to he's asking for a workshop link, and I don't know how to give that to you easily. There's an email going out today or tomorrow that will have the workshop link in it. Yes, the easiest way to sign up. I'm sorry if that sounds disjointed for those of you watching. The easiest way to sign up for the workshop is hang on until you get your email. Little sip of coffee, or wait till you see it in the social media posts. I don't like to leave the link on the YouTube channel forever, or people will be signing up 2 months from now when it's already happened, right? So that's kind of my reasoning there. So let's get quilting. I'm going to start, as I so often do at the beginning of the day, with my stitch regulator on. You can think of this first session in the morning as your warm-up session, or I often do. I don't usually do warm-up on a separate quilt sandwich. But I'll put my stitch regulator on and just kind of get the feel of it, get in the flow of it, make sure that I know what size I want to quilt, and get things going smoothly. And then I like to stitch without that stitch regulator on. I was working on this early this morning on this quilt, and I did have a little bit of having to pay attention where the backing has the pieced work in it. There are some bulky seams back there. So I will show you guys what this looks like without the stitch regulation, but I probably will mostly leave the regulator on today just so that I can slow down when I'm going over those bulky seam areas. You see the lovely signatures? This is going to be such a special quilt for me. Joan, bless her heart, even went so far as to take all the bits of fabric and put together a binding for me. So she made the binding all ready to attach. Speaking of binding, one or two of you referred to the daily morning chats. So again, remember, you're watching this in the middle of October 2023, so if you catch a replay much later, this may not apply to you. But as we speak in the month of October, I am going live on YouTube every single morning for 30 days. So today was day 19, and we were talking about different ways to bind a quilt. So whether it's the double fold bind that we see so often, where your binding is made, folded in half, sewn on one side, and hand stitched or machine stitched to the other side, whether it's bias or not, whether it's self binding, which is folding the backing around to the front to cover the edge of the quilt and stitching it down. And I even had an example of a quilt that my mom made with prairie points for the finishing touch, which is not a binding, but is a finishing edge for a quilt. So that was kind of a fun one. So if you want to catch that, look for the live on October 13, 2023. So I'm just filling in this entire central area of the quilt with this all over design. It's a little bit reminiscent of a feather. It's got the same feathery plume kind of shape. And this is kind of my own take on this design. You might see variations of it done by other quilters. This is my own take on it with the spiral shape in the middle. If freehand quilting is a skill that you've been wanting to dive into, or if you already are a free motion quilter but you want more designs, then you may be interested in my freehand quilting masterclass that is coming up. And in fact, next Saturday's workshop is very much an introduction to it. I'll be talking about it more there and giving a lot more details on it. But I mention it now because this is one of the designs that is in the masterclass. And so in that course, I go into it in a lot of depth, step by step, breaking it down into its parts, walking you through how to quilt it, how to travel around a quilt top with it, etc. This type of edge-to-edge quilting that we're doing in the middle area of the quilt here, which isn't a true edge-to-edge because we're not going out to the edge, but you know what I mean, an all-over design. This is my favorite. I love the whole process of choosing a design that feels like the right fit for the quilt that I'm working on, and I love the whole repetitive nature of this, of figuring out how to do a design and do the same thing over and over and over again and make it look pretty. I love this stuff. So again, if you're new to these live and unscripted episodes, this is mostly the style of quilting that you'll see. Every so often I do a custom quilt, but not very often. And I can definitely feel underneath. I'm right over this area that has a piece backing now. And it's going fine, but I can just feel, because I can't see the seams right, I just feel the resistance here and there as I go over those seam allowances. So I'm just taking it a little bit more slowly than I might otherwise. And I do have a 90-14 needle loaded, which is a pretty robust needle. That helps too. I am stitching with Isacord 100% polyester thread in a 40 weight in an eggshell color. If you're an Isacord user, 0101 is the color. Even though the background of this quilt is very definitely quite white, this eggshell color does a very good job of almost picking up whatever color it's laid over. There was a thick seam both front and back right there. So I can use it on white fabric quite nicely, and I can use it on quite creamy fabrics as well, and it still looks good. And in fact, I use it on pale greens and pinks and yellows too. And it just seems to kind of pick up a little bit, whatever you lay it over. I'm about at the limit of the front throat space of my machine. I'm just waiting for it to bump. I made it! I made it! What else can I tell you? I'm stitching on a Bernina Q24. The 24 just means it's the 24-inch throat of Bernina's Q series long arms. And I have the ruler foot on right now because I am going back and forth with the ruler work, and it's easier to just leave it on, in my opinion. So what makes it a ruler foot is how thick it is. It's a 1/4 inch deep so that it can rest up against a ruler and not risk stitching up over it. So this Friendship Quilt, I began the quilting process, I should have looked up the date before I came on air, but it was at some point in August. And so if you want to see the whole loading process, that's part of that earlier episode, as well as quite a bit more discussion about setting up and planning the quilting for the border, and even planning how that pieced backing, how it was going to appear in the finished quilt. Because Joan was making it really truly scrappy, it's not perfectly asymmetrical, so I just kind of looked at it, laid it out on my floor honestly beforehand, and thought through how I wanted it to look in the finished quilt so that I could place my quilt correctly on top of it. I'm also using a Hobbs 100% wool batting. I personally love wool batting, so I use it in a lot of my own personal quilts. It's very lightweight and yet a little more fluffy than a polycotton blend, or certainly than a cotton would be. And it is washable, but it does require just a touch more care than the blend types. Just in that you don't want to wash it in super hot water or run it through a super hot dryer, or you will get a ton of shrinkage and matting. So I don't always recommend this for family quilts necessarily, or for people who, think of their quilts as a blanket. But I do love wool in my own quilts, so that's what's in this one. That brief little pause there was while my eyes were flitting across the quilt to decide which direction I wanted to go next. There's no shame in pausing, let me tell you. So as soon as I get to the end of this pass, we'll pause for a few minutes for yours truly to get a sip of coffee and to answer any of your questions. So now is a great time to be typing questions in. It is helpful to Mr. Producer if you put the letter Q in front of them, because then he can search for that. When there are hundreds of comments coming in, it can be all too easy to miss seeing a question. So just put the letter Q in front of it if you would, and then he can search for and bring up all the Q comments. Tell you what, this quilt is going to provide a lot of enjoyment time snuggled up on the couch, looking at all the different fabrics and of course all the different names. There are a lot of different fabrics and styles represented in here, and that's the beauty of the scrappy quilt, a little bit of everything. Did you notice that when I need to get to another area, when I see I'm kind of getting myself quilted into a corner a little bit, I just travel. I just echo and travel to the area where I want to put another motif in. I try in general to have the portions that are further away from me quilted first, so that I never have to sort of quilt behind it. But it doesn't always work out that way. It doesn't always come together smoothly. So having a way to travel across the quilt is super helpful, and echoing is one great way to do it. And here you see I'm coming up against the edge of the dark border, which is going to have piano keys. It already has piano keys. What am I talking about? That's what I did earlier this morning. And the rest of my house was still getting their beauty sleep. Again, just traveling to where I think I want to put the next plume to try and pull up this last little corner. A little bit different from an actual edge-to-edge quilt. I have something on both sides of me, right? I have the portion that I'm doing this design in to my right, and I have this border to my left, so I have to be thinking about both of those as I'm filling up this last little area. Oh, my thread just popped. I heard it go with a snap. I don't know if that was a thick seam. I don't think I was over one. So those of you who watch often know my rule of thumb is if it breaks once, I just rethread it and keep on going. If it breaks twice, then I'll start looking deeper for reasons. Thread breaks do just happen sometimes. You're stitching at a fairly high speed. So I've rethreaded my needle, and now I'm going back and pulling up my bobbin thread because it's not broken, it's still hanging underneath. So there's my bobbin thread, so I'll pull that up so there's no tail underneath. Snip it off. And I was actually very close to a corner when it happened. I'm going to get my seam ripper and just undo a couple of those stitches to the corner. And it looks like it wasn't stitching quite right for 2 or 3, so I'll go to the corner before. I like to do my splices at a point. Are we able to see that? Because when you let's have the head cam for a moment. So here's my point right here. When you approach a point, there's always a few shorts, for me anyway, there's always a few tinier stitches that approach, and it's kind of secures that area. And so I like to go back to a point because I feel like my thread is most secure there. And of course it's easiest to join when you're not on a smooth curve, for example. A point is the easiest place. So I've just overlapped a couple 3 stitches from the earlier line of stitching, and now I'll just carry on. And I'll take a pause and cut those thread tails, and no one will be any the wiser. I'm pretty sure. As long as you never tell. Oh, and I bumped the edge. Look at that, you guys. I've got a square corner on my round plume. Okay, that calls for backing up just a touch. I bumped the front of my rail is what I did. And by the way, a quick tip for you, if that happens to you frequently and you can't, or it's one more thing to concentrate on, you know, knowing how much further you can quilt, an easy way to fix that is to, if you have a long armor's tape measure, you can lay it across the front and attach it on both ends of your frame, or even easier, get a piece of blue painter's tape and just lay it on the front of your quilt. You know, figure out where that maximum quilting depth is, run that painter's tape along, and you can see that out of the corner of your eye at all times and know in your peripheral vision and know how far you can still go. So what I'm going to do is just advance my quilt by 1/2 inch so that I can go ahead and finish that plume that I've already started. So I'll do that right now. Just a couple stitches worth. Alternatively, because this is busy fabric and a busy quilting design, I probably could have just ended my stitching, and because I'm almost to the place where I need to end it anyways, right? And I could have just come back and started elsewhere. But for the purposes of showing you that, it's done now. And now I am going to end my stitching. Now again, because I've got a border on this side, I can't just end my stitching over in the basting on the left hand side, so I am actually going to lock stitch it really thoroughly here and then pull up my bobbin thread and trim it. And it's right beside a print. No one's going to ever see that. And then when I advance my quilt, I'll just start stitching down here somewhere. All right, let us move Stella the long arm out of the way and take all the stretching apparatus off, and then we'll talk a little bit about your questions. Okay, let me just get the quilt rolled up a little bit. And I think that's about as far as I can go. So I've got these are the Red Snapper brand too, but they're called E-edge clamps. That's what I'm putting on the sides, just to put a little tension out to each side. And apparently we have lots of questions. Good for you, being all inquisitive. Clamp number 2. We're good to go. Grab my coffee and let's chat. Helen, when sewing straight quilting, how far apart do you make the rows? 1/2 inch or 1 inch? Thank you. On this quilt, Helen, I'm doing it 1 inch. And you'll see when I get to stitching it, Joan was kind enough to make the half square triangles in the border are exactly 2. So I'm not particularly measuring or pre-marking. I'm just doing on the half square triangle seams and halfway in between. You'll see when I get to that with my ruler work, it just made it super, super easy to know where to quilt them. You know, it's a busy, busy border, so I didn't think quilting more frequently was going to add anything to the quilt. And the 1/2 inch lines tend to pull in more as well, kind of like the ribbing on the cuff of a sweater does. So the 1 inch does a little less of that, so I opted for 1 inch. Susan Raynars, what do you do to take a quilt off, do something else, then reload the first quilt? So I did talk about that a little bit earlier, Susan. In the example of this quilt, I fully dismounted it because I wanted my red snappers for multiple other projects in between. But a lot of leader systems will have a zipper on them, and you can literally zip off the hem that is attached to your quilt, both top and bottom. Store that folded while you're working on something else. Put new zipper hems on and proceed with the next project and go back and forth in that way. It is a little bit of hassle, and so I don't do it more than I have to, but you know, when you have to do it, it's nice to know that you can. Penny, I always seem to have more difficulty with basting the left side of the quilt. Any tips? Penny, I suggest that you watch some of my episodes on that feature more of the basting. A lot of my loading processes, I do talk about that basting. One that comes to mind is an older episode, but still a good one, and it's called the 2-inch minimizer, for reasons you might imagine. But it had several inches of excess in the border, so I talked about how to deal with that super amount of fullness and several ways, in fact, to deal with it. So, are you having trouble with it's not staying straight or it's stretching out? Like, those are kind of two different problems. But in my loading portions of the videos, I talk about that quite a bit. So check back for tips on that. But pinning is always a good standby to get it in the place where you want it to be before you start stitching. Joan, this is like watching a school play and seeing your kid. Ask Susan what it's like to quilt something that is flat and square, I hope. It is, Joan. It's funny though, you'll see when I get into this last pass of doing the edge to edge, I do have a little bit of fluffiness, and I'll talk about that and why I like to float my tops, and it's relative to this. So we'll get into that a little bit. Anne, when do you use a sock on the thread cone? Good question, Anne. The reason for the sock or the thread net or whatever it may be is so your thread pulls out smoothly and doesn't jerk as it's unwinding off the spool. And also, if you have some reason that your thread sometimes catches. So I got into the habit of using a thread sock back when I had my gamel. And just the way that the spool holder was constructed on there, the thread would sometimes hang down a little bit and there was a screw that it caught and it would break. And that happened to me often enough that I thought, oh, hey, if I put a thread sock, because it was literally a portion of a sock, a portion of the foot of a sock with the top and bottom cut off. If I put a thread sock on there, that thread will never sag down under there. And so that worked well. On my Bernina, I started with using the thread sock, but I find that I don't have any trouble with it. So I typically don't. Like, why go to that extra step if you don't have to? So that's my reason. Mr. Producer searching. Debbie, I'm getting a Bernina Q20 on a 10-inch studio frame next Friday. Woohoo! I'm watching as many of your videos as I can before I get it, learning so much. So good. And I hope that you can come back to them afterwards, Debbie, because sometimes, you won't remember it all until you get in the situation. But I've done a lot of situations on air, so hopefully you'll find the help that you need looking back too. Susan, I hear you talking about wool batting. I'm finishing my new granddaughter's first quilt, but wonder about batting. I'd like it cuddly using flannel for back, but what batting? I don't know that I recommend wool for a kid's quilt because it's apt to get washed quite frequently. Now, it's not wrong. You might get more shrinkage out of it. And if it happens to get stuck in a really hot dryer, you might get a lot of shrinkage out of it. You know how wool felting is made that way by wetting and heating, and wool tends to mat a little bit. The wool batting, however, is quite processed and made fairly washer friendly. So I just don't know that I would choose an all wool batting for a kid's quilt because it's going to get used harder. So that said, I love blends. I love 80-20 blends, which are cotton and poly usually, but there also is a cotton and wool blend. I know Hobbs makes one. Other brands may as well. Still 80% cotton, but that 20, instead of being polyester, is wool. And that's a very nice batting too. And it gives you some of the qualities of wool, very lightweight, a little bit fluffier, and a lot of the good qualities of cotton. Hard wearing, natural fiber, all those things. So there's some suggestions. Carol, can the masterclass be picked up anytime, or is there a specific start and stop? It can be picked up anytime, Carol. I do enroll a group of students at one time because I plan for 6 weeks. I plan quite a few live Q&As, and I'm really active in the Facebook group, etc., etc. So there's a lot of support that first 6 weeks. However, you have access to it anytime, and you don't have to start it at all in those 6 weeks. There's no getting behind, in other words. You always have it. Sue, which do you prefer, regulated stitching or non-regulated stitching? Both is my answer. There's places for both. I love getting in the groove with the non-regulated, and again with my morning chats, I talked about it earlier this week, so in about the 10th of October. It's more relaxing because the sound is even, the machine flows a little more smoothly, so I really enjoy non-regulated stitching, but there's lots of reasons why I use the tool of regulation sometimes too, and today is one example. When my backing has some thick seam intersections that I can't see, I don't want to go zipping over those at a high speed and break my needle, right? So it's a good time to put the stitch regulator on so that I can, be adjusting slower and faster as necessary. When I'm doing a brand new design, I'll often put the stitch regulator on. Certainly when I'm doing ruler work. There's lots of reasons. So both have their place. I'm a quilted to death quilter, so I'm going to use some finer thread, maybe 50 to 60. Any recommendations for brands? Well, there's lots of good brands out there. For sure, I recommend at a long arm 100% poly thread. Even at a domestic machine, you're doing so many stitches. Anything that has cotton in it builds up so much lint. I haven't honestly quilted much with silk thread. I think that's a strong thread too, but my experience chiefly is with the polyester thread. Many of these, Isocord included, Isocord being the brand, were developed for embroidery machines. And so they were made for high-speed stitching. They're strong and a little bit stretchy, and they're very forgiving. So Isocord is one great brand. Wonderfill is another. Glide is another. Dash is another. There's lots of good brands out there. And certainly 50 to 60 is not too light. I think if you're doing super dense quilting, like a fill of pebbles, you might even go with an 80 weight. Give that a try. Jenna, have you long-armed a quilt that was stay-basted? I have one from a customer. I have the one or two that I've done, Jenna. I actually took the basting out because it's easier to load on the long arm without that basting in. I think it would be entirely possible, but I think you'll want to remove the basting as you go so you don't put a million stitches over top of it and have a heck of a time removing it later. My opinion. It's easier to load without it in, though. It really is. Shelly, what size are your plumes in relation to your swirls? Oh gosh. Like my whole plumes are like bigger than my fist. So my inner swirl is 1.5 inches-ish, and my plumes are about 1.25 inches long, something like that. I will post photographs of this after the fact, and you can, get the kind of relation of it then, I hope. They vary for me a little bit too, depending on the quilt and how dense of quilting I want. But that's what I'm doing today. KS, is your mastery course helpful for someone like me with a Bernina Q20 on a lift table versus a frame? I've learned a great deal watching your generously shared videos. Thanks, Carla. There are a number of students in the master class, like alumni students, who use sit-down machines of some form, whether it's a domestic or a sit-down long arm. And certainly most of the design work translates well. I do teach the class at a long arm, so my demos will be done at a long arm. I did learn to quilt first on a domestic machine, and so I have some understanding of that, so I think I can safely say most of the designs will translate well. You just might, this plume for example, you might do on a smaller scale. Instead of doing a 6-inch plume, you might do a 3 or 4-inch plume, just because it's harder to do the large sweeping curving motions. But most of the designs will translate well. Certainly a lot of the tools I use and the design thinking that I talk about, like converting things that you see, ideas that you have, into continuous quilting designs, that will all apply no matter what machine you are stitching at. My dream, and I've learned not to put a date on it, my dream is to also record the designs at a sit-down machine and make that part of the class. That is a massive project and I haven't gotten it done, but one day. Shannon, where do I sign up for the masterclass? Thanks, Shannon. It's not actually open yet until next Saturday when that workshop happens. That's when the cart opens. However, you can go to my website, and of course it's a brand new website. I think the tab is called Learning. But anyway, if you look for the masterclass there, you can get on the wait list for it. And that's not a bad idea because I do offer a nice little bonus to those who purchase that have been on the wait list. You get an early entry, a couple days early, and a little something extra for being on that wait list. So you can sign up there. Lori, how many stitches per inch are you using? I've got 10 on right now, Lori. And I tend to do 10 to 12 is my norm. Ken, looking back, share one thing you've always done in your business that you are happy you've always done, and one thing you're doing differently than when you began. Thanks for all you share. No, that was a Jason. Mr. Producer thinks this is the lady on her son's account, but it's not. But, if you're not Ken, I'm sorry. But the comment came in as Ken. Okay, one thing I'm happy I've always done. Certainly this is true at the long arm. I have always basted the perimeter of the quilt as I go. to keep the whole thing flat and square and smooth. I'm astonished. We have a rental shop here in Spokane, in my city, they run 5 or 6 long arms and they rent them out. And I'm astonished when I walk into the store how many people just lay their quilt top on and start quilting. And of course it all goes into the middle and it's impossible to get it square and flat. So I've always basted, and even at my sit down, I baste. So I'm always happy about that. What's one thing I would have changed? I think probably for me, I'm a people pleaser, so I promise sometimes more than I can deliver. So I have learned to, for example, wait time. I've learned to make it longer than I think it will be so that I can over-deliver instead of over-promise and under-deliver. So that's the thing that I have adjusted over time. Get real about how long things take. Sue, I just noticed you didn't have your magnets on. Did you float your top or red snapper it? Ha! You are very sharp, Sue. I did mention earlier, I was already quilting early this morning, and I've done a little bit different order so that I'll have time to show you the ruler work. And one of the things I changed is I've already gone down to the bottom and done the basting and the stitching in the ditch around the border, so it is attached. You'll be seeing it the next time I advance. It's just right here in front of me. That's why I don't have magnets on. It's all attached already. Debbie, when you lock stitch, do you ever get a knot or mound of thread on the back of the quilt? I don't, Debbie, but you notice when I do it, and notice when I go to start quilting again, I hang on to the top thread, take one stitch, and pull that bobbin thread loop up, and then I hang on to both of them. And you want to do this if you're at your domestic machine too. You always want to grasp both those threads before you start stitching. Always, always, always. I think I have a video about that too, starting and stopping. Gretchen, I'm a new edge-to-edge, hand-guided long-arm quilter. I like to use pantographs, but the edge keeps turning in and I quilt it down. Any suggestions on how to prevent this? Sure do. Does your machine have a spoon or a cup foot? That really helps. It's got a curved bottom. So in some machines, it's a whole other foot. On my machine, it's a clip that goes onto my foot, but it's got that curved edge. So I do the same thing when I'm doing digital designs. I put that foot on so that it skates over those edges without pulling them up and quilting them down. Selena, where do you post pictures? Usually on Facebook and Instagram. Those are the easiest platforms for reaching the most people. YouTube is not really photo friendly. I have quite a few on Pinterest as well. Catherine, I was gifted a queen size quilt that has been quarter way hand quilted, thinking of taking out the stitches and do them on my long arm. Any thoughts? Wow. I'm sure there are people who don't agree with me on this, but I have faced the same situation. And my answer was to take out the hand stitching. It was a grandmother's flower garden quilt. I have not yet quilted it on the machine, but that is my intention. There were a couple reasons. One, do you really want a quilt that's got both things in it? Unless there's a reason for that, for a conversation piece or to tell your grandmother's story or something, I think continuity is better, consistency is better. And in the case of my quilt, all it had for a batting was a flannel sheet, and it was in very nasty shape, and the backing was ugly too, so I didn't really want those anyways. So I just took it all apart so that I had a nice, clean, fresh top to work with then. So that's my thinking. Crochet Mama, do you baste as you go or baste the entire quilt and then go back and do the quilting? I baste as I go. Watch any of the other live and unscripted episodes. In almost all of them, you'll see me basting the sides, quilting, basting the sides, quilting. Terry, any tips for quilting a minky backing? Ha! Glad you asked, Terry. There's an episode on that too. It's quite fun to now have this library of YouTube episodes and be able to say, oh yeah. And I'm pretty sure minky backing is in the title. It's got kind of a dark blue backing. You know, the tips have to do with not overstretching that minky for sure, because it is stretchy fabric and the tendency is to roll it too tight. So you really need to let that minky relax. Your quilt will probably feel a bit like it's sagging compared to when you're using a quilting cotton. So that is certainly one of them. Gosh, needle size, I don't know whether to tell you. Sometimes I find a bigger needle works better, and sometimes I find a finer needle works better. There's so many things that work together, right? There's longer and shorter nap that we call Minky. Minky is actually a brand, by the way. And there's like what you've got on the top, what type of fabric and how many seams and what fiber of batting, like all those things factor into it. But have a look at that episode. It gives some tips at least for loading the Minky and for keeping it from stretching and then rolling back up when you take it off the long arm. Okay, Joan, tell Susan the bright colors didn't bother me. I just wore sunglasses the whole time. Joan, you're so funny. Yes, well, was Susan impressed with your block, Dave? I'm so impressed. And I think I might have been over that one. Oh, there. Thanks for sending a picture, Joan. Yes. See, here's the thing you guys don't know. I don't think that Dave has ever sewn before in his life. But with Joan's coaching, he was able to actually piece those blocks. I knew nothing about this when it was all coming together. So, total surprise for me. Lauren, so fun to see all the names and hometowns of everyone. It sure is, Lauren. And we did take the time before I got to all these central signature blocks to ask, to put the question out there. Does anybody mind if we publish their names and hometowns? And across the board, everyone said, no, go ahead. So that was great. Hi from Germany just spotted my block. Yay! How exciting. And Amy saw her block. Yes, I saw Amy Fran. You'll see it again because it's still being done here. Okay, you guys, let's get going again. So as I do with the whole edge-to-edge quilt, I like to alternate which side I start at. Even with the plume design that doesn't really have a right or a wrong side, you know, when you're quilting from right to left, they all do kind of point in the one direction. So I like to alternate directions. So now I'm going to start at the left and go toward the right on this next pass. And it just keeps it all looking, you know, organic and flowing. I'm just going to take my bobbin spool off here. I see that it's really dangling a sag of thread. I'm also going to check my bobbin because I think that it's running low. It's been rattling. So let's just do that while we're close to an end and perhaps change it out. This is another thing I love about the red snappers, by the way, is I can slide them right under my hopper foot. Yeah, my bobbin's very low. I'm just going to change that. It will never last through the whole pass, and it will just save us stopping. And while I do it, I'm going to put a drop of oil in as well. I do put a drop of oil in with most bobbins. Bernina recommends at a minimum every day that you're quilting, but I find in practice, you know, especially if I'm putting in a day with some hours of quilting, I have to do it multiple times. And my machine kindly sort of lets me know. It gets this little rattle going on. The bobbin just starts rattling when either it's low or it wants oil. My machine, by the way, is named Stella, which amused me this week because some of you may be familiar with Stella Lighting. It's a brand of particularly crafting lamps with a great daylight quality to them. Anyway, they reached out to me and sent me a lamp to try. And it's Stella Lighting, and I thought that was just too cute. Stella's a good name. So I am anchoring my threads in the stitching in the ditch that's at the side. Really, you could do it anywhere in this busy of a quilt. But to whoever was asking, I think it was Debbie, about anchoring my threads, do you see how I've taken one stitch and my bobbin thread was pulled up in a loop and I'm grabbing it? And I always start this way. I grasp both those threads and now I take a few lock stitches. Sometimes I do it twice just because if some's good, more's better. Take a few lock stitches and quilt that down. I want to talk about one more thing. Joan was asking how it is to quilt on a flat quilt. It's wonderful, but what I found due to several factors is I do have a little bit of fullness in this last pass area, and it has nothing to do with Joan's piecing. It's a couple of things, and one of them is that I have this puffy wool batting, right? And so when I advance the quilt in order to base the bottom edge, and then I roll it back, this happens to me. There may be other quilters that have figured out how to deal with it, but this happens to me. I end up then with puff and excess. And this is chiefly why I don't typically baste my whole quilt and then come back and quilt it, because I was always dealing with this. And when I would get to the last pass, I'd have to take out my basting because I had excess fabric that I didn't know what to do with. So I usually float. Again, if you watch any of the other episodes, you'll see my top is floating the whole time and I don't anchor that bottom part till I get right down to it. But today I did. It's good to try these things every once in a while anyways. It's just good. Cut my thread tails. And I'm going to echo back up to the top. So just in case you're not familiar with the Bernina, those little red lights that you're seeing are the cameras that are reading the movement of the fabric over top of the camera. So the red doesn't really mean anything, they just shine red when they're on. And there's 2 of them. So that is the stitch regulator at work. Those cameras are watching carefully, and every movement of the fabric over top of them, they're adjusting the speed to try and keep my 10 stitches per inch length consistent. This time I'm not going to quilt all the way to the bottom simply because I have to do one more pass anyways, and I don't want it to be a 4-inch wide pass because that's hard to fit the plumes into. So I'm just going to do a quick batch of plumes across the quilt and then do a partial advance so I can see all the way to the bottom of this section, and then on we go, filling that in. If you are enjoying this episode, I would so appreciate if you'd give it a thumbs up. If you're not already a follower, I'd love if you'd subscribe to the channel, and clicking the little bell will give you notifications when I go live. For the remainder of the month of October, or at least till the 27th, I'm also live on YouTube each and every day, talking for a few minutes about quilt-related topics. This morning's topic was different ways to bind a quilt. An upcoming one this week is going to be how I store my batting and measure it and cut it. I have batting rolls in my studio. You may or may not have rolls in yours. But Mr. Producer made me a lovely rack for my batting, so I'll show you how he did that in case you want one too. So yeah, clicking the notification bell will let you know when I'm live for those. And don't forget to be watching your newsletter. Either later today or tomorrow, you'll get an invitation to next weekend's workshop and a link to register for that. I am going to be presenting it live, however, it will be recorded and a replay will be available, but you need to register to receive that replay link. So even if you don't think you can be there, go ahead and register. The beauty of coming live, if you can though, is that you can ask questions. So even though the workshop will be available later, the questions only come if you're there. Or the answers only come if you're there when it's live. Amy, if you're still watching, here's your square. Seriously, this quilt is so incredibly special to me. The fact that students from all over the world would take the time to make a square, choose fabrics, send it to Joan. Yeah, it's pretty meaningful. I'm just looking at the little bit of fullness that I've got here and kind of assessing it. I just want to make sure that I don't end up with a ridge of it, you know, when I get to the bottom of the quilt. So it pays to take a minute and look every once in a while and see, do I need to be easing a little bit more in? This curvy design of Plumes actually is pretty efficient at easing in little bits of fabric if you need to do that. Always a curvy design is a better choice than not curvy. The swirls, the plumes, they all work really well to pull in any excess fabric that you need to. I'm just using my left hand to actually push it up under the needle a little bit. Doing a little bit of preventive work now, I think will save a disaster at the end. Well, not a disaster, but we'll make it a lot easier at the end. You can see a bit of this fullness here, and I'm just going to slow down a little bit, encourage it to go under the needle, encourage the fullness to get taken up in those little plumes. And as I say so often, nobody will be any the wiser. It's only pleats that show. Puffy doesn't show in a finished quilt, only pleats show. So if you can manage the puff, you're golden. My spirals aren't as round when I'm doing them one-handed, and that's a fact. I'm always amazed by the quilters who quilt exclusively one-handed. I find that difficult on my 24-inch machine because it's fairly heavy. It's just difficult to make smooth turns one-handed. Do I have enough to advance? I think so. Okay. I'm going to take off my side clips and advance just 5 or 6 inches. And then I think I'll have enough room to get right to the bottom of this interior space. After that, if you're just joining, this quilt has a multitude of techniques. So I'm doing an all-over type design in this interior white space, and then on the outer edge, the dark black or charcoal border, I'm doing piano keys. So it'll be a thread change and a bit of ruler work. Do we have any pressing questions, Mr. Producer? Someone is asking how I hold my red solo cup on the top. Well, I've tried different methods. At the moment, I've just got a magnet that's stuck to my machine, and I've got 2 cups with a magnet between them. And so it's not really attached, it's just resting there. I don't know that it's ideal. On my old machine, I actually had it glued, the magnet glued, but that's what I've got for now. Mr. Producer, would you mind opening a patio door? very, very warm in the studio today. I suspect all the lights we have going have something to do with that. And can you see I'm down at this edge now, and I have managed to take up all the fullness. No pleatage going on, so that's good. I'm happy. And again, I certainly want to reiterate that did not have anything to do with Joan's piecing. It has to do with the super fluffy batting and the fact that I basted it down to the bottom and then rolled it up. And as you can imagine, on that roller, the one layer then is stretched a little further than the other layer. And so the top of the quilt, I don't know. For me anyway, it seems to have that little extra bit of fullness then when I baste all the way to the bottom first. But I'm just coping with it. It'll be fine. And it honestly is minimal. You know, it's probably maybe a 1/4 inch. So we're not talking massive here. I kind of have two choices here. I can either do smaller plumes, which is kind of what I've been doing, or I can literally travel along in that edge, stitching in the ditch portion, much like you would at the edge of a quilt with the basting. You can either squish your quilting design to fit inside of it, or you can make it look like it's been trimmed off and extends beyond. Either one seems to look fine. And I'm tucking in some swirls now as I go. It can be difficult to go back and fit in little half plumes. So I'm just taking some element of this design, whether plume or swirl, and tucking them in along that slim edge as I go, just to fill the whole thing in. And again, I'm traveling to where I see that I need to go back and fill in. There's no one right way to fill in this last slim pass. I'm just making it up as I go. I'm slowing down a little here because I'm over that pieced area on the backing and I can feel those thick seams. I have a story for you guys while I do this. Make sure you're sitting down. So yesterday I was working on a custom quilt for a client and stitching merrily along, and I still don't fully know what happened or why, but I had a needle break and it shattered. It went with a bang. And of course I'm stitching along at about this pace, right? So I stitched, I don't know, 6 or 8 stitches before I could push the button to stop or stop moving. And that broken needle shank was sharp and actually made a hole in my client's custom quilt. Talk about heart attack. Talk about heart attack. Oh my goodness. Anyway, the happy news is, I mean, it was tiny for one thing. It might have only been one thread that was cut. It was pretty tiny. But some years back, I was working on a quilt of my own, actually to go into a show. It was a highly, heirloom custom quilting kind of deal. And that happened to me only at the time. I had the stitch regulator off, so I did a lot of stitches. And I made a hole through all the layers of the quilt, like backing and everything got a hole. So at that time, I reached out to people in the quilting world, colleagues, Facebook groups, etc. And I found this fusible, basically a textile mending substance. And it's a powder. And you sprinkle it into place. If you have the matching fabric, you cut up teeny tiny fibers of it and you put them in it, and then you iron it. You heat, sort of weld the whole thing together, and what it does is, seals off any of those raw edges from fraying, and it doesn't have any color. And so anyway, this little product is called Bobbin. So that's what I used on my quilt way back when. And on mine, the hole was big enough I actually had to put a small patch over it. And I was able to blend that whole thing down. So in yesterday's case, it was very, very tiny, and I just put that fiber weld, if you will, in the area. And it comes with a little Teflon pressing mat. And got out my hot iron and fixed it and confessed to the owner of the quilt. Oh my goodness. And then I had to have a nap to recover from the heart attack, let me tell you. Oh my goodness. There's hardly anything worse that can happen, I don't think. So all of that to say, when I'm buzzing along through these thick seam allowances, this is one instance when you can't see it on the back, but another instance, might be a t-shirt quilt or just something that's got problem areas. I have just learned to really slow down and give my machine time to, the needle flexes a little bit, and just give it time. And it tends to avoid the awful problems. You all could make me feel better, by the way, by telling me your own horror stories and how you fix them. So this will be the last pass of this all over type design. So if you have any questions regarding this, now's the time to ask them. And then I'm going to pause and change thread color and start working on the piano key border. So I'll put my ruler plate on and you'll get a chance to see a little bit of ruler work there too. So this end is where the most puffiness was. But can you see I'm just able to manage it? I'm literally pushing it up under the needle a little bit faster than it would pull on its own. And that little bit, repeated over and over again, is going to keep me from having a pleat when I get to the bottom edge. And the little feather plumes just swallow it up in their curvature. And my thread broke again. This is a long time after the other one, isn't it? But maybe it's wise to just do a quick rethread of the top. Just in case. Snip it. Sorry, I didn't mean to bump the camera. It's always my go-to solution. First solution, let's put it that way, is rethread. I'll stick with rethreading the top for now. If we still have trouble, then we'll think about rethreading the bobbin. So once again, I'm figuring where that ended, and my bobbin thread is still intact down there. So I'm going to pull the bobbin thread up. There's my loop of it. So I know that I don't have a tail underneath, right? And then I will go ahead. I should have left a top tail. Somewhere I have a seam ripper. You wish you didn't have to keep one of those. And I'm just going to undo until I, know that I'm back to good stitching, good solid stitching. And also a point. And I think, because this point here is on red, and that's a bit obvious, I'm actually going to go back to the point before that, and also because this point, like so, can you see it now? This point here is in a seam allowance, like there's several layers right here, so those stitches are going to be more secure also than the ones that are out in the middle. So for that little bit of work of undoing one more plume, and I know my join is going to be absolutely solid, it's worth it to me. So those are the things I look for when I've got to do a splice in the middle of a quilt for whatever reason. A point, because then it doesn't show if you've got, you don't get a funny angle and a curve, for example, and then also putting it in a seam allowance is just a really secure way to do it. It's very difficult to undo when I've got a camera over my left arm, just saying. But I don't mean to complain. So I've just trimmed the threads. They're not tied off and buried or anything like that. I know those last couple stitches right here are pretty small and are pretty tight together, pretty secure, and I'm also going to go over them, 3 or 4 stitches with my new thread. So I've got both my tails intact. It's not the neatest one I've ever done, but a couple little lock stitches there, and we're up and away. Take a moment to cut my thread tails. This is the final corner for this all over pattern, so get your questions in now. And then we'll be switching to a little bit of ruler work. And I'm just filling in with anything swirly here. When you're in tight corners like this, you often can't get a whole pattern repeat in, or even a quarter of a repeat, so just fill it in with something that's in your quilted design. A spiral, a plume, anything that looks cohesive and meant to be will do just fine. And I'm not necessarily going to end in the corner. I'm just going to end somewhere along that stitching in the ditch that I did along the border. That's my only goal at this point. I'm going to make these look like they're falling right off the edge. And back out to that edge, and a few lock stitches in that ditch stitching. A few more, make sure it's secure. Good, that part is done. Alrighty. So I'm going to take my side clamps off, because I need to put my ruler plate on. I probably don't have to take them both off actually, but I do have to advance the quilt a little bit. So let me show you the ruler plate. Did I really put it away in the drawer? That was silly. Nope, where did I put it, you guys? I was working with it this morning. Oh, Susan's running around looking for the ruler plate. Okay, too funny. Where did I put it? Has to be here somewhere. Mr. Producer, help, please. You guys, it's a big old acrylic plate. Where did I set it? Okay, this is hysterical. Okay, guys, you can start laughing now. It's on. It's on already. Look, here it is. Right there. Okay, so You know, Susan's losing her mind a little. But let me tell you why the ruler plate. So this is what is typically on my machine as the base, the nose of the long arm, if you will. But this ruler plate gives me what I need, which is a little table to rest my ruler on when I'm doing any kind of ruler work. So two things that are really critical for ruler work is the foot that's got the thick edge because it's going to be next to the ruler, and having some type of ruler plate. Different brands have different apparatuses, but very necessary for doing ruler work. So what happens when you have the ruler plate on, and what got me started thinking about it, is I also lose a certain amount of clearance at the front of my machine. I can only come so far forward. So you can see I've got to advance my quilt far enough that I'll be able to do the ruler work right to the edge. So I do in fact have to take my other side clamp off. Yes, Joan is noticing that I mentioned the ruler plate hitting the frame earlier. Here's the funny thing, Joan. I mentioned hitting the frame. I was not thinking that the ruler plate was on, but it kind of makes sense because my mind's eye should know by now where that place is, right? And the fact that I bumped it is just because the ruler plate was there, and so my guesstimation was off. So I'm seeing that I can't get my side clamp actually in the side now between my... Can anyone see this? Try and show you guys what I'm talking about. Here's my red snapper, and I can't get my side clamp on between that and my long arm rail, so I'm just going to put a side clamp on, a single clamp, which will be totally fine for this ruler work. So to see the ruler plate more, is that what you're asking? I'm going to lift it up. That's why my yardstick. Now, maybe not. Well, let's see what we can do here. Do you want to put the bigger camera on so they can see what I'm doing? Here's what I'm doing, you guys. Here are the logistics I'm working with. Joan didn't know that I was going to do ruler work, right? So she's given me about 5 inches on this side of the quilt. It's similar on the other side too. Once I've got my ruler plate on, it extends out so far, like it is at the edge of the quilt right now. And I'm not able to stitch to the edge without bumping into a clamp. So I'm just trying to figure out which clamp is the best one to use and how far I have to lift it. And I think that will work. That's lots. Okay. So I'm just moving my long arm around, literally, with my clamping apparatus on everywhere that I need to stitch. How far to the left do I need to go? How far to the front? Am I able to move it freely? Am I going to bump into anything with my ruler on? And I think I'm good to go there. So let's go do the same kind of process at the other side. I mean, an option is to not have side clamps on. It's not ideal. It's not ideal. When you're working with rulers, that tends to pull the fabric askew a little bit as you're moving them. I just need to have that clamp lifted high enough. Lifted high enough. That's not ideal. Okay, here's the solution I am choosing. What portion can you guys see? The other end? You can see down here if I talk now. I'm going to be doing corners in this corner of the border and then parallel lines all the way across. So on the other side, I keep running into the clamp. So I'm going to go ahead and quilt the corner down there with no clamp on and then put the clamp on afterwards to do the rest of it when I've kind of cleared it, if that makes sense. So let's go ahead and do that first. But I do have to change thread before I do any of that quilting. We'll do it at this end, actually. So you'll remember I said earlier, I chose to do a dark charcoal thread on the top. So this brightly printed fabric, it's not actually black, it's a dark charcoal. So that's what's going to be on the top. And then on the backing, because it's white, I didn't love the look of the dark charcoal on it. So I'm actually doing a mid-gray in the bobbin. Both of them are still isocord threads. So still the 40 weight polyester. This is a large quilt, so I don't have tons and tons of room to get at my bobbin and things on the edges. So let's take the white out of the bobbin, put the mid-gray in, Tension feels good. Okay, and we'll put the dark charcoal on the top. You guys can't really see me at all. I don't know that there's a good place to be doing this. So I'm curious, now that we are into October, how many of you have an opportunity to go to Houston to the quilt show, which starts 1st of November? And I am so excited to report that I am going. I have never been to the Houston Festival or show. And I'm going as a working girl for Bernina, so I'll have to probably go early and stay late if I want to get a view of all the quilts. But I'm just excited to be going. Okay, we now have charcoal thread in the top, mid-gray thread in the bottom. We have our ruler plate on. Houston, we are ready for launch, I think. Okay, I need a marking utensil. Let's see. I guess the head cam, Dave, will be the thing here. See if I can show you guys what I'm doing. So you can see that I've got the 1-inch wide piano keys, we call them, on this side. On this bottom edge, they're going to go a 90-degree difference. They're going to go vertically. And in the corners, I want to make them actually turn the corner, right? So that I get this nice little mitered look. So I'm just going to draw a line from the corner of the border to the corner of the quilt with my little chalk marker, which is not dropping chalk very well. Ooh, that's quite a line, isn't it? To guide me in this. So I'm going to start with this one. And I've got to tell you honestly, when I get into 1-inch piano keys, I tend to eyeball their placement. I sometimes mark the first dozen or so until I get kind of geared up for it. And after that, I tend to eyeball their placement and I don't mark every one in, but you certainly could. So now I'm just stitching to my little mitered line and then making that 90-degree corner. Oh, one too far. There are certain angles that you're holding your ruler that it's really easy to use the markings on them to determine this spacing, but there are other angles that it's very, very difficult, and rather than sort of turn myself inside out, I choose to just eyeball them. But that's just me. And the little ones I don't even bother with a ruler. Okay, now we're into the main bits. So now I want my line to end up right by the border corner. So I want a nice neat join there. And what I have chosen to do, and I talked about this more in that earlier episode when I first loaded this quilt too, I have chosen to double stitch these lines, and here's why. I'm going to pause here because I find it much easier to go from left to right, so I'm going to go do the other corner and then come back. But here's why I've chosen the double stitched lines. Let's get a close-up look here again. We've got the close camera on, yeah? Okay. So right here is my stitching in the ditch around this white inner area, and it's done in my eggshell thread. So if I had my druthers with a piano key border, I would stitch up and across and down and across and up and across, right? And just basically zig and zag my way along. But when I do that, I get this line of gray stitching and then not, right? Because I crossed at the other end, and then a line of gray stitching, and it looks ugly, I think, in that ditch to have gray areas. And so I've opted to be at the bottom edge here, on the outer edge, do all my traveling there and stitch up and back, travel, up and back, travel, up and back. So it's just an option. It does give you double stitched and therefore heavier stitching, but it's an option, and it's the one I choose. This time I'm going to start in the middle. I just feel like it might be easier to establish my join to the inner corner from the inside. I just lock stitched there. And I did forget to draw my line. Let's do that quickly. My 45-degree angle. Super easy. It's just from the corner of the border to the corner of the quilt. We're done with the marker. And again, Susan is back to eyeballing the placement of these lines. It looks like about an inch. Stitch up to my chalked line, to the outer edge. There we go. Let's trim those tails. So here's where I mentioned earlier. Well, let's get up to one of them. Joan was kind enough to make these little half square triangles exactly 2 inches. So can you see this block here? This is 2 inches from side to side. So I can literally use the line of my ruler lined up with that seam allowance and really help me. So for this one, I for sure am not going to mark them because I can use Joan's squares. But in any case, I wouldn't be marking them. I'd just be eyeballing them still. It's pretty kind of Joan to give me a nice little guideline. It certainly was helpful when I was coming down the sides of the quilt toward myself, because that can be very awkward to hold the ruler. If you have to hold it above anyways. And so I was able to hold the ruler below and stitch on the top edge of it because I could see where to place them quite nicely. So you see what I mean by the double stitching. And that's just one of the decisions you have to make. You know, which matters more to you? Not seeing that funny gray thread traveling in the ditch, or not seeing the heavy stitching that these have become. Because this fabric is so dark, I'm totally fine with the heavy stitching. It doesn't seem out of place. And other options, of course, might have been to go ahead and stitch this border with a light color, the same light color that's on the quilt. I thought that would stand out a bit much. But when it's your quilt, you get to decide. So we didn't stop for questions really after the end of that all over pattern in the middle. Did you guys have any questions? I'm going to pause and get a drink. I'm feeling very parched. And we'll see if there are some questions, and then we'll go on, because then this is the end, this border. Yahoo! I'm so excited. Okay, Simply Quilting with Nancy. Is your machine really that quiet? It is quite quiet, Nancy, but also I use this particular microphone because it does not pick up room and machine noise as much, so that keeps it reduced. So it's hard to tell you exactly what it is, but it is pretty quiet. As long arms go, the Berninas tend to be quite quiet machines, yes, which I love. Joan, Dave, please let the participants know how much I enjoyed this project and getting to know them. It sure made getting the mail more fun. So I'm sure you mean, Joan, all the various students and friends that contributed to this, because I think there was quite a flurry of emails and snail mail packets going back and forth. Really all over the world. I know Germany is represented in here. Norway is represented. Clearly Canada. I have some students in South Africa. I didn't see South Africa in here. Ecuador. Yeah, so it's just really, really fun to see all these different states and countries represented. Erin, what is the link to buy the ruler you are using and the name of the ruler? It's by Quilter's Apothecary, which is Jamie Wallen's company. And it is there's a link, Erin, in the notes of this and I think all of my YouTube episodes. So if you know how to look up the description, like there will usually be a line or two that's showing right below the video, whatever device you're watching on, and often you have to click show more or 3 dots and you'll get the whole description. There's links in there to a whole bunch of my favorite tools, and the code for this is in there as well. There's a collection of rulers, Stitched by Susan collection, and you get 10% off any ruler from that grouping. Jason, I tried basting the whole quilt, and when I got to the bottom, I had the full issue too, so took out basting. Mary Ellen, Now I remember. Emmy. Yes. And I've had that happen to me so many times that that's one of the reasons I stopped basting all the way to the bottom. I know there are quilters that do it. They must have figured out a workaround or figured out how to manage it. But for me, floating tops has worked beautifully. So I continue to do that. Susan, is this pattern in the advanced package? This quilting design is not. It is in the Freehand Quilting Masterclass. It is in my full-fledged online course. It's one of a collection of just over 30 designs that they span a wide variety, and from feminine or from simple loops to, this is one of the more complicated ones, the plume. So there's that whole variety in there, a whole repertoire of designs. In the advanced membership, I purposely always do different content because sometimes it's the same people and I don't want you to feel like I already paid for this over there and now I'm paying for it over here. So advance, all the designs that are in there are different ones. Betsy, I know this has probably been asked, but what size is the block and what size of square was the colored fabric? That ruler does not have inches. I will tell you the block size because that's easily done. The finished block is 5 inches. So it looks like the square that was put on it was 3 or 3 1/4. They vary a little bit, maybe even 3 1/2. And I don't think that it would be wrong if you did it differently. If you're consistent throughout, your points would match up, right? But the 5-inch block with the, maybe Joan can answer, the 3 1/4 or 3 1/2 inch, point on the side, that left a nice area for signatures. There's plenty of room to sign. Janine, I've not tried ruler work yet. Not sure what kind of ruler to get. I'm not sure whether I need low or high shank rulers. Not knowing your machine, I'm not 100% certain. Like usually long arm rulers are just long arm rulers and they're 1/4 inch thick or 4 millimeters. I think it's 4 millimeters thick. The low shank and the high shank usually refers to a domestic sewing machine, and I would definitely ask your dealer or someone else who owns that brand of machine. I don't know the details on that because I always do my long arm work or my ruler work at the long arm. For me, I find this 8-inch straight to be my most often used ruler by far. It fits in the hand well. It's not so big that it's unwieldy. It's not so tiny that you can't, you have to move it every 2 inches. It's just a perfect fit and size for me. I love this ruler. Okay. Oh, I should mention too, one of the other things that I love about the ruler is the fact that it's got this handle. Can you see that? Kind of at a 45-degree angle on there. I mean, there are other rulers and other ways to have handles, and I think they all serve the same purpose, which is you can then grip and hang on to the ruler in multiple ways as opposed to just having to put downward pressure on it, because that gets very fatiguing on your fingers. So I love having the handle for that reason. Okay, let's get stitching, you guys. This quilt is almost done. Anybody want a binding job? Of course, Joan was kind enough to make it for me, so really she's done the hard work already. So while I do this repetitive stuff, let me remind you once again, thumbs up if you've enjoyed this episode. I would so appreciate that, and feel free to share this or any other episode with your friends who are also quilters. I absolutely do love showing the real side of quilting on my channel, so that's what you get a lot of from me, real life. If you are looking for some easy listening, check out my podcast at podcast.stitchedbysusan.com. It is called Measure Twice, Cut Once, and most of the episodes are interviews with other quilters and crafters who tell their stories and what their craft has meant in their life. And if you wish to support this channel, you can do so very easily at buymeacoffee.com/stitchedbysusan. Those who have become members there and regular supporters, we've created a rolling credits at the end where their names stream by, so if you're a member, you'll see yourself there, and we sure do appreciate those of you who have so generously supported us, whether members or one-time. There are many who do a one-time gift, and I appreciate that too. That is what has made our lighting and our cameras all possible. I could not do it without you guys. Be watching your inbox. Today is the 13th of October as we air this. By tomorrow, the 15th, I'll be sending out a newsletter with an invitation to a workshop on October 21, all about the art of freehand quilting, but particularly dispelling the myths that make you think it's not for you. Of course, the truth is, it is not for everybody, but it is indeed for everybody who wants to do it. It absolutely, positively can be learned. So my workshop is all about sharing my stories and my experiences and those of students and just dispelling those myths. By the way, if you happen to quilt for clients, and honestly this might be helpful for you if you're quilting for yourself too. I don't know if you're noticing, every time I'm coming back toward me, I'm getting a little bump and a shift. What's happening is my ruler base is, you can see it in the camera there. My ruler base is beyond the red snappers when I'm stitching to the edge of my quilt. So when you are doing ruler work, it's a good idea whenever possible to have not only 4 inches of backing around the quilt edges, but to actually have 8. And this is kind of why the ruler extends and the ruler plate extends, and all these things just makes it easier with a little bit more elbow room. In a pinch, I've also done this type of thing with a smaller ruler than this 8-inch one, because sometimes there are corners that you just can't get in if you have little excess backing and a large ruler. So sorry about that. I didn't have enough time to warn Mr. Producer to mute the mic. You all got to appreciate my sneeze. I hope you all have enjoyed this quilt as much as I have. It has been such a treat to work on it and see all the names as I quilt over them, and just, it's truly is a bit amazing to me to think that someone would want to spend time making me a quilt like this. Like, I just appreciate it so very, very much. I know that Joan invested a ton of time and thought and care, and I sure do appreciate it. It's interesting, when you're a quilt maker and you have a quilt made for you, you absolutely know what went into it, right? Makes it all the more touching. I had a good chuckle this morning. Last week I posted a reel, just a very short, I think a 20-second video, and it was of me getting quilts ready to take to a trunk show. So I was kind of one after another flipping them out flat and stacking them on the floor. Anyway, this one gentleman commented, "Nice blankets, one can never have too many." And you know, I fully realize he's clearly not a quilter, and he's just trying to be kind and say lovely. But it just makes you chuckle and appreciate those who do know what a quilt is. And it's not a blanket, is it? One last plug before we finish. Remember that I am live on YouTube each and every morning, Pacific time morning, until the 27th of October, talking about quilt-related topics. Feel free to respond in any of those with topic ideas, or email me, info@stitchedbysusan.com. And I'm happy to chat about those things with you and show you what I can and share what I've learned over the years. And they will be remaining on YouTube, so whether or not you're, watching them in real time, you can always come back and catch them later. So I'll probably make a playlist and put them all together so that one could, if one wanted to, watch them sequentially. Anyway, doing that for the rest of October. There's, I think, about 13 more days left. 12 or 13 more days. Two more lines, you guys. We're almost there. This line right here, this is the finish line. And we're done. A few lock stitches. All right. I shall park Stella and grab my coffee, see if there are any more questions or comments. Coffee is so good. Elaine, bless you. Well, thank you. I'll take it. I'll take it, you guys. I appreciate it. Jan, how long have you been quilting professionally? I don't know if I can put a beginning date on that, Jan. I got my first long arm machine February 25, 2015. So 8 years coming up on 9. I had already been quilting a little bit for hire at my domestic machine. So I guess you could say I was professionally quilting, if for hire is the definition of it. Anyway, that's kind of my time frame. Because I love it so much, I did dive in with both feet, and I'm at over 1,200 quilts now. Done freehand. So I've done a lot of quilting. So 9 years is really neither here nor there. It's the number of quilts. I hope you get a massage on your neck by Mr. Producer when you're done. You must be noticing that I really hunch over my quilting when I'm working. I'm so trying to adjust my posture because I don't have to. I can see it just fine. Anyway, I'm working on that. But thank you for the thought. Jane, jumped in late. Border piano keys appear to be double stitched. Is that correct? They are, Jane. And I did talk about that and my reasons for that a little earlier, but chiefly it's because I'm stitching them in a dark thread, and my ditch stitching around the interior portion of the quilt is in the eggshell thread. And so I didn't like the look of my dark charcoal going up and across a little ways and down. And then, so having it started and stopped the gray, I didn't like that look, so I opted to just go up and down and do all my traveling in the ditch. So, Denise, can I ask what you will bind this with? It's a beautiful, colorful quilt. It is a scrappy binding as well. I don't have it to hand, or I would show you, but Joan made it already, and it is mostly, as I recall, Allison glass fabric, so fairly bright. A lot of the brights that are in this quilt. What I love about Allison's fabrics is that they read as a color. So the yellow will read as yellow, though it might have smatterings of pink and orange and charcoal or something in it. There's not much white in them. They just read as a color. I love that. That color just satisfies me. So it is a colorful and scrappy binding. Kate, delightful. Thank you, Susan and Mr. Producer. You're welcome. And by the way, Kitty was here all day today too. He's just laying off to the side, my black cat supervisor. Judy, our guild members love to introduce first-time attendants of the Houston Festival by taking them upstairs at the convention center to the big round windows and just let you look down and be amazed. Okay, find me, Judy, and take me. I'm all ears. I'm all eyes. Because it is a first for me. I've never been to Houston before. I'm quite excited. Debbie, lovely quilting. I can only hope to be half as good someday. You absolutely can, Debbie. It might take 1,200 quilts, though. So if you're prepared to do that, you can do this. No, really, anyone that wants to can do it. It is so like learning handwriting, and all of you did that. I know it's less common in schools anymore, but in my vintage and a lot of you, we did handwriting in school, and it's such a similar skill set. So if you can learn to do handwriting or calligraphy or decorative writing, you can absolutely learn how to do this, I promise. Anyway, that's it for today. Join me live whenever you can. We try and do live and unscripted episodes twice each month. They're always on a Friday and always at 9 a.m. Pacific time. And in my newsletter, I give you a couple days warning of what the topic will be and usually have a picture of the quilt. So try and join us whenever you can. It's just live streaming of me working on a project, most often a client quilt. So it's not a lesson, and sometimes the colors are hard to see on camera, but it's just inviting you into my studio to see what I'm doing and to chat and visit with each other, and it's always so much fun. So thanks again for joining me. One last thumbs up before you go, and I will catch you next time. Have a great, great day.